go up. It's gonna go. What's happened is it'll go low, but there's for every time it goes low, it'll also swing back up. And thoughts are things, so keep that thought out there.
We become just abstract universal human beings, nor can we afford simply to be situated in our own locality like a cocoon, hopefully that some real meaning of life is being preserved. And the only option that is open to us is to search for both and. How can we be both global and local? Which is, of course, the challenge that is presented to us, and they've offered all kinds of fascinating applications about it. My own sense is that the modern West, informed by the Enlightenment mentality, even though the term is not used, but it's very much the background of the discussions, has been the most powerful and transformative ideology in human history for the last 200 years, some say 500 years. If we look around ourselves, the spheres of interest that shape our existential world here and now, the market economy, democratic polity, science, technology, mass communication, multinational corporation, research universities, and even bureaucracies at all levels, what Max Weber called forms of rationalization, characterize our modern world anywhere, in Boston, New York, Tokyo, even in Lhasa, in Hawaii, Bali. And some of the underlying values of the so-called modernizing process or enlightenment, such as liberty, equality, human rights, privacy, dignity, independence and autonomy of the individual, and due process of law, are universal values many of us cherish. Sometimes, ironically, I don't find that many powerful, passionate defenders of these values, either in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Berkeley, California, but they're in New Delhi, in Beijing, in Taipei, Tokyo. However, the West is not the embodiment of enlightenment as we understand it. The West is also the embodiment, modern West, of the Faustian, Promethean drive to conquer, to overcome. We never undermine the strength, both the spiritual and secular strength of that, but we should also be critical aware of the destructive power of that force. When Bacon talked about knowledge, not as wisdom, but as power, and even the image, he deliberately cultivated an image, that our ability to rape nature, to force her to reveal the secrets. And even in Marx's idea of the humanization of nature, what we have there is really the total subjugation of nature for human consumption. But what is emerged in this mentality, it is stated as His Holiness's view, and it's very much Pua's argument, and certainly Dr. Masafa's observation. But what's emerged in this particular kind of mentality, it's called modernistic mentality or even postmodern mentality, is on the surface the mechanization or even quantification of our life world, but at the same time, a kind of anthropocentrism, scientism, not science or technology, but scientism or superstition about the power of science that has overwhelmed many spiritual voices all over the world. Take the example of China. In 1974, during the Cultural Revolutionary period, China sent a delegation to the first international conference on the environment in Stockholm. The Chinese delegation is the only delegation that refused to sign the preamble. And the preamble, there is a statement about the limits of growth. They accepted it, but also the limits of science and technology, and they refused to accept it. This particular secular humanism, a dominant ideology, believing that a brave new world is among us, is upon us. There's no need for us to heed ever attentively to the spiritual forces that for centuries have shaped the human condition. You don't have to listen anymore to Buddhism, to Taoism, certainly not to the so-called primitive religious ideas. You don't have to listen to your own traditions, either in the Christian or the Judaic or Greek or Islamic traditions, because now in the modern period, we have the human capacity to transform the world according to our design. That arrogance has been extremely costly. And here we have the authentic voices of saying no to that particular process. We need to explore the spiritual resources of the human community as a whole, including the resources in the West. The kind of Christianity that did not become simply the Protestant ethic or the spirit of capitalism. The kind of Christianity that takes the dominion over the world as the stewardship, rather than as control, manipulation. Many non-Western civilizations, I'm always intrigued by the fact that Islam has been sort of typed as the radical otherness. And yet, without Islam or Islamic contribution, it's difficult to imagine the development of Renaissance or the Reform, because it's part of the tradition that contributed to the rise of the modern West. But if you take into consideration of the Islamic traditions, of Hindu traditions, Buddhist traditions, Confucian and Taoist traditions, the so-called non-Western spiritual traditions, there are all kinds of resources that could be explored and generated for rethinking about the human condition. In addition, of course, Pua reminded us there are all kinds of indigenous religious traditions, not just Hawaiian, Native American, Maori, other traditions. These rich resources will have to be refigured, reappreciated, and represented. The environmentalists, the feminists, and the religious pluralists, together with our spiritual leaders, have helped us to understand what normally some political scientists simply call the politics of recognition. Everybody wants to be recognized, to be part of this game for power, wealth, is in fact a spiritual quest for personal self-understanding, for communal participation, and for human flourishing, broadly defined. The image I have about true authenticity to its own roots, one's own roots, ethnicity, gender, territoriality, language, basic religious orientation, and globalization is the image which is in the Sufi tradition of Islam of digging a well. You are absolutely serious about your own ground of existence without leaving it, and you dig deeply into it so you reach the common spring of communication. You don't forsake your primordial ties, you honor them, but honor them in such a way you recognize every human being has the right to honor their own primordial ties. They are different from yours. Therefore, the pluralistic spirit has to be recognized as a way of human flourishing. And that digging eventually will reach different levels of communication. That communication will evoke powerful spiritual forces from many traditions. Therefore, on the surface, we're very different and recognize that difference. But that recognition is not simply to tolerate difference, to be superficially recognize pluralism. We dig deeply into our own ground existence for the sake of true communication. It is in this particular kind of spirit, I think it's rather remarkable that a discussion on local identity and the global community as a spiritual project with, of course, far-reaching political implications should not be simply politicized as if it is only the politics of recognition. For example, if I want to be a true Confucian, it is a process of learning that involves attainment, involves the appreciation of history, of literature, of thought, certainly of language. That's true with trying to be a Hawaiian, a Tibetan, a Muslim. And that process of learning, which is learning of culture, is not at all in conflict with our willingness to take part in the global community which hopefully will be enriched by many different currents of thought and different ideas. Thank you. Now we are moving into the final movement, the segment of our meeting today. And I think the game plan is to ask a series of questions already prepared by you. And since a number of scholars have been kind to read some of the questions first and try to coordinate it. So we have certain kind of order, but we want to make it flexible so we'll be able to accommodate many other observations as well. But this meeting will adjourn promptly at 3, and we're going to have enough time for the 3 distinguished panelists to make the final observations, 5 or 10 minutes they see fit. But we'd like to begin with the question and answer period, and most of the questions, or quite a few of the questions addressed to His Holiness expectedly. And I will read the questions, and so we'll answer the way you see fit. And there are other questions that we've raised, and I'll ask the other 2 panelists to join in as well. But I think it's also a good idea that the questions that are addressed to His Holiness may have repercussions for other cultural traditions, and so the other panelists are invited to respond to that as well. One question is straightforward. How would you transform the negativity, the negative forces in the world? It's my magic. How would you transform the negativity, the negative forces in the world?
I think from the Buddhist viewpoint, there can be, I think, the external negativities, external nature, or some internal nature. So first, I think in order to challenge the external negativities, or confront the outside negative forces, the important or appropriate method is first try to transform from within. So then I consider the within internal sort of the negative forces. Of course, I think from the viewpoint of different philosophy, different spiritual tradition, there can be, I think, variety, or there can be different identities.
It is also possible that given differences in one's own belief systems, certain modes of thinking and certain forces of mind which may be considered negative in one tradition may be considered also negative in another tradition. So such diversity of opinion might also be possible. For example, strictly speaking, from the Buddhist point of view, the notion of an independent agent existing as a unitary, sort of eternal subject, as a soul, something abiding within the person, is considered to be, in fact, a source of a lot of suffering and miseries, which may not be the case from the point of view of other religious traditions.
But then I think probably I think all major world religions, I think, they can all consider something negative forces or evil force. I think that's the hatred or jealousy, or these things are considered as a negative. Then, without involvement about religious faith, I think they, as a human being, and even I think the person who very much concerned about one's own health, from that viewpoint also today, these mental factor is the negative forces, negative element. So without any religious faith, I think we can make clear presentation. We can make a clear presentation. Within our mind, there are some negative element or negative also thought, which very harmful for one's own health. Besides daily mental peace. So this I think we can transfer through reasoning or through I think through thinking.
How can nonviolent resistance succeed against violent repression?
That's a difficult. I think at least some cases, or I think there are some cases. The strict non-violent method may not effective. For example, usually I feel like the Second World War or the Korean War. Perhaps I think they inspired a lot of destructions and suffering. At least some, I think, positive result. I believe. Now, at least, like for example, Korea, because of the war, at least the part of Korea remain a free country. Now today, much more prosperity. At that time, if not stopped by force, today maybe it's a situation I think entirely different. But then generally I always believe the violence is I believe against the human nature. Of course, aggressive nature also part of human nature. But my basic fundamental belief is basic human nature is gentleness, more compassionate. So therefore, through non-violence, although the achievement may not 100% satisfactory or may take longer period, but once you achieve that thing, that is the genuine achievement. So generally, I believe the non-violent method is much more healthier, right? Much more sound and much more effective for longer. That's my view.
If you could speak to the political leaders of China, what would you like to say to them?
I think first, I would like to tell them, oh, please study more about Tibetan culture. You see, your reason is, I feel, the conflict, in this conflict, I feel one major factor is ignorance due to lack of knowledge.
Yes.
So then very difficult to communicate with them. And on top of that ignorance, the communist ideology. There's some kind of, within their brain, some kind of bamboo curtain is there. So, very difficult to penetrate in it.
This is a question for Alani. You recommend that we find out, quote, who we are. But many peoples, including many Hawaiians, are of mixed
racial, cultural, and spiritual heritage. Who are they supposed to identify with? For them, the idea or the identification has to be on a more universal level, transcending local culture.
The person that asked the question, are you Hawaiian? No, you're not Hawaiian?
Maybe related to this question. So today there are many non-Hawaiians living in Hawaii, and most Hawaiians are not 100% Hawaiian ancestry. In your opinion, what is it that non-Hawaiians can do to assist or to benefit Hawaiians in the healing and empowering process and taking place in the Hawaiian community? For example, is there a place for non-Hawaiian in this process?
Okay, the reason I threw that question back out is because I think you need to be part Hawaiian to be able to answer that question for yourself. I don't have that problem because I am Hawaiian. I don't have other ethnic backgrounds or races in my family, so I don't have the problem of having to be loyal to other races. But I do have friends, and I certainly do have families who are of mixed races. And I think that I cannot answer the question for them. They need to answer the questions themselves. If they live here in Hawaii, then I think that they should have a great deal of loyalty to this land. There are, like being a Christian and being a Hawaiian, a lot of people don't understand how I can mix the two. I don't have a problem with that. Other people have a problem with that. Okay, so I cannot answer that question for them, like I cannot answer this question for those who are mixed race, because I don't know how they feel. I think that as long as they live in this country and in this land rather, and enjoy those things which are of this land, I think there should be some loyalty to being Hawaiian. But I know that they do have loyalty to being Chinese as well, or Portuguese as well. And as I said before, I've had family and friends who have done a lot of work as far as genealogical work with their Chinese background, with their Portuguese background, and that's fine. That's who they are, and this is who I am.
Another challenging question, using Hawaii as an example, is there a way to ethnically reconcile our desire to procreate, continue our genealogies, as well as to build up the Hawaiian nation in the face of the crisis of global overpopulation?
Oh. This question?
Question, please.
Okay. I was, prior to my going back to Hawaii to teach at the Hawaii Community College, I was teaching at Maui Community College for a number of years, and it came to the time where I thought that, no, it's time for me to go home. Because whenever I would leave Maui and go home to Hawaii and see the mountains again, the Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa, to me, they're my ancestors, you know, and it gave me, it revitalized me to go back to Maui again and stay for another weekend and come back. And finally, when I decided, no, I'm going to go back, and I didn't have a job to go back to, one of the things that I thought that I would do is open a dating service called Antipoa's Dating Service. And Antipoa's Dating Service had to do with repopulating our Hawaiian race. I don't know, I got another job, so.
This is a question for Dr. Muzaffar. How does, again, a challenging question, we only select challenging questions now. How does one reconcile the principle of compassion with the condemnation of the writer Rushdie to death for negative writing?
Can you repeat that?
Thank you. Now, as far as the edict issued by the late Khomeini against Salman Rushdie is concerned, not many people would be aware that there have been a number of Muslim scholars and activists who, even at that time, in 1989, I think, stated openly that the edict was against Islam. Even if one agrees that an apostate, a person who renounces Islam, should be put to death, the procedures which have been prescribed in Islamic jurisprudence are very clear. You have to give the person a chance to defend himself or herself. And Salman Rushdie was not given that opportunity. It was just an edict issued by Rushdie, and he told the Muslim community that if someone was prepared to kill Salman Rushdie, they would be rewarded. In this world, with a hefty financial reward, and in the next world, he guaranteed them a place in heaven, which of course no person has the right to guarantee another person. Now, from the point of view of Islamic jurisprudence, it was wrong. From a larger perspective, the idea that an apostate should be put to death is something which has been challenged from within Islam for a long, long while. And when this particular edict was issued, Islamic scholars came out and said that within Islamic philosophy, there is no death sentence for an apostate. I myself have written an article on this. I wrote this immediately after Khomeini's edict, and I argued that it was wrong of Khomeini to have issued a death sentence, because in Islam, a person has the right to leave the religion. Islam is very clear that that person will have to answer for his or her decision vis-a-vis God. But no human being can issue an edict and say, look, I put you to death. It's not for us. In fact, the line in the Quran that says, this thing goes along these lines. It says there are people who go in to the faith, there are people who come out of the faith. You're not the keeper of their conscience. It is they who will have to answer for this. This is the concept. So you can see that what Khomeini did was wrong. What is sad is not enough Muslims spoke up at that time. And what is even sadder, those Muslims who spoke up, who took the other position and argued this is wrong, they were not given the same degree of coverage in the mainstream Western media as those who supported the edict against Salman Rushdie. You just take the example of Britain, where the whole thing happened. There were a number of leading scholars, including the chairman of the Mosques Committee of Britain, Dr. Zaki Badawi, very well-known Egyptian Muslim scholar living in Britain. He came out openly against this. In fact, he said that as a Muslim, he disagreed completely with what Rushdie had written. It was certainly blasphemous. I myself regard it as blasphemous. It was wrong. It was foolish, many of the things that he said, because Muslims, like people in other faiths too, they have a certain view of the sacred personalities in their tradition. You don't blaspheme them in that manner. But having said that it was blasphemous, it was sacrilegious, it was wrong, Zaki Badawi said that he would defend the right of Salman Rushdie to live in his own home. And yet, this was never given much publicity in the mainstream Western media. This, I think, is part of the problem, which people in the West, especially people in the media, will have to address. If we want a better understanding of each other's religion, I think it is important to strengthen the more universal, rational, sane voices on all sides. You'll find that in Britain, unfortunately, there is a tendency to give a lot of publicity over the BBC, for instance, to people who, in a sense, confirm the worst stereotypes about Islam. So you'll have some people who would come out breathing fire and brimstone, and they give it a lot of publicity because somehow that suits certain vested interests, because that projects Islam in a certain way. Now, this is what I think we have to overcome. Thank you.
So another one.
Why? Now, this is one area where there's been a great deal of misconception about how the Quran sees women. I wish we had more time to discuss this in depth, but let me say this at the outset, that by and large, the Quranic view of the woman is one which, without any doubt at all, supports the concept of the equality of the sexes, the rights of the female, which in fact in almost every area acknowledges the woman as a human being in the same way as the male. I'll give you a few examples, very quick examples to support this, and then I'll perhaps very quickly say why a certain misconception has developed within the Western world and also within the Muslim world. What are the evidences that support this view of the woman in the Quran? First, in all those things that relate to spirituality, there is no distinction between male and female. There are numerous verses that say that for the male and the female, if you do good, this is your reward. For the male and the female, these are your obligations. For the male and the female, these are your rights pertaining to spiritual and moral obligations. Now, when it comes to social obligations, on a variety of issues, you will find that women were given the sort of rights that no society in the 7th century had. Number one, the Quran gives the woman the right to keep her name, which means her identity on marriage, which is very, very important. That a woman retains her name. She does not take on the name of a husband. So you will find that in many Muslim societies to this day, the vast majority of women, including Western educated women, retain their maiden names. Number two, the right to inherit property, which is a very important right, provided in the Quran. One could argue perhaps that the amount given to the woman, the female child, is not equal to the amount given to the male child. It's true. But then the female child is also entitled to inheritance from sources that the male child is not entitled to, from her uncle, from others who are required to support her, from her husband when she gets married, and she keeps the share of her property. The husband has no right over it. Even when a divorce takes place, the woman retains control over it. The right to divorce, provided in the Quran. Not something that is initiated by the male alone, but something which is initiated independently by the woman. The right to work, stated clearly in the Quran, that she has the right to seek an occupation outside the home, and what she earns, unlike what the husband earns, is hers in its entirety. What the husband earns must be used by both the husband and the wife and the rest of the family. The woman has total rights over what she earns as wages outside her home. Again, yet another point, the woman has the right to equal education, as in the case of the male, without any distinction. Let me recommend a very good book written by an African American, on the question of the woman and the Quran. In fact, it's called The Woman and the Quran. The author is Dr. Amina Wadud Mose. She teaches in a university in Virginia. Very well researched, one of the best female interpreters of the Quran, and a book that has received wide acclaim, not only within the Muslim world, but also outside the Muslim world, because it's an attempt to interpret from within, without apologizing or saying this is what the position is. Now, having said all this, it is also true that in the Quran there is polygamy. There's provision for polygamy, which, without any doubt at all, a woman would be right in arguing it is against her interests. But polygamy, if you look at the Quran, the provisions pertaining to polygamy are also very lucidly stated. You just cannot take another wife. In fact, the pertinent line in the Quran goes along these lines, that after a war where there are orphans and widows, the males are told that they can take 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, and that's the maximum.
Oh, God.
Provided,
Is that all?
provided they can do equal justice to all.
Oh.
And it goes on to say that doing equal justice to all is not possible.
Ridiculous.
In other words, one could argue, as interpreters of the Quran have done, that this was a very clever way of limiting polygamy in a society that was polygamous, given its period, the 7th century. So it was a very intelligent way of saying, look, polygamy is not allowed. The only circumstances in which it can be allowed is when there is a war, you have orphans and widows, and you have to protect the rights of the widows and the orphans through multiple marriages of that sort. Now, you will notice that in a number of Muslim countries, polygamy has been banned or restricted severely. In my own country, there are restrictions on polygamy, but in Tunisia, polygamy had been banned. Turkey had banned polygamy, and Iraq at one time had banned polygamy. So there are countries that have banned polygamy. Now you have to see this in the proper context. Now let me very quickly, I know I've taken up a lot of time, Mr. Chairman, but because it's such a controversial issue, I beg your indulgence to just explain a little more. Now how has this misconception come about? One, because after the initial period, after the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the early caliphs, the forces of patriarchy became very, very strong in Arab society. In that particular period, these forces were not powerful at all, so much so that some of the leading authorities vis-a-vis the life of Muhammad and the Quran were actually women, including Aisha, his wife, who played a very big role in interpreting the Quran, which meant that she had a very significant public role. And more than that, what is important is that women held positions of importance. Women held positions of tremendous significance during the first 30 or 40 years. But a lot of it changed with the onset of a very powerful Arab male patriarchy. And that lasted for centuries. And today you'll find that in many parts of the Muslim world, women are treated very badly. But again, you cannot universalize. This is what is wrong. You take my own country as an example. If you look at the role of women in public life in Malaysia, you'll be very surprised to hear this, and I'm going to shock you with this, that if you go on the basis of specific statistics, Malaysia has more women cabinet ministers than Britain. Malaysia has more women at the head of ministries and government departments than any West European country. And this is a country with a Muslim majority population. If you look at my neighbor, Indonesia, women have very prominent roles in public life, and that is the largest Muslim country in the world, mind you. You'd be very surprised if I told you that within a few years after the vote was given to women in Britain, Egypt gave the vote to women on the basis of an edict issued by the leading religious scholar of the day, that women had the right to play an equal role in public affairs on the basis of a verse in the Quran which had commended one of the greatest administrators and political leaders of that time, the Queen Bilqis, who was the contemporary of King Solomon. Her administration and leadership was commended. Women were given the vote at that time. Now these things are not highlighted. We also forget that at the level of prime ministers today, if you look at the world as a whole, there are more Muslim women prime ministers than women prime ministers from any other religion. You have 3 women prime ministers from the Muslim community: the Prime Minister of Turkey, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, and the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Have you ever asked yourself whether it would have been possible for Muslim men and women to support Muslim women as prime ministers if it is true that the prejudice and the antagonism towards women in public role is so great in Muslim countries that somehow this would be totally intolerable? It was not. It has not been. Why? Because at the level of the populace, there is a certain understanding that they would accept the role of women. It is some religious elites who have been distorting the religion for their own interests. And what is sad is, within the West, and this is my final point, Mr. Chairman, within the West, anything, and pardon me for saying this is a very, very candid discourse, anything which puts Islam in a negative light is given a lot of prominence. And the question of women has very often been used as a stick to hit Muslim civilization as a whole. I don't think it is fair.
of the moment thing. Pua, would you tell us a little bit about the role of women in Hawaiian spirituality or Hawaiian culture?
Well, you know, when you look at the men and women, the men have to try harder. And because they have to try harder, they get more attention. Women don't have to try hard. We don't have to go through any rituals to prove that we are women. Men have to go through rituals to prove that they are men, so they get more attention. The fact that we give birth proves that we are women. And it also proves that we are the creators.
Yes.
So in doing that, I don't think that I need to make excuses or look at the women as being the weak point. I don't. In many of our stories and our poems about the Hawaiian literature, women are always the prominent. And it is not until they get into politics that men become the more prominent. Other than that, it is the women that do the ruling, and it is the women that move along. And so, as far as in many of our stories, it is the women who are the strong as far as love is concerned, being able to love somebody, being able to show love. And it is the men who has not been very good at that, being able to maintain the love. And so in many of our stories, the men are shown as being the weaker of the two. But when you come to politics and when you come to war, then of course they're the stronger of the sex, because who wants to go to war and fight and get bruised and et cetera. I know, it's facetious, but that's, that's all I have to say about that anyway.
His Holiness may choose not to answer. But the question about women in Buddhism is being addressed.
I think the reality, I think, a little bit is complicated. And then also, you see, I think the Tadang communication.
This question of women in sort of traditional societies is such a complex issue that it also has many different angles, and also given that depending on what angle you adopt, it also tends to give sort of different results. However, the basic reality of the situation is that men cannot live without women, women cannot live without men.
Now in the Buddhist tradition, of course, firstly, not only human being, entire sentient being, have the potential to become Buddha. So usually we call Buddha nature. So, and on that basis, and also I think some other reasons, is a desire for happiness, desire for overcome suffering, also is the same. Therefore, these are the reason, which is the conclusion is, they all are equal, same. All have the same right. Then within human being, of course, men, women, I think as far as right, essential right is concerned, so Buddha gives the same rights. The highest, I think, same time, the bhikshu consider gyaloma shunuchi gyaloma demojilia gyalompa shunuchi yandi respect machi
At the same time, we do see certain sort of trends of discrimination or bias. For example, like even though both men and women have equal opportunities to be fully ordained, but in terms of seniority, even a junior monk, fully ordained monk, is considered to be more senior than a senior nun.
So this looks some unequal. Then this is this according to Vinaya system. Then the Sutriyana system, the
So this is the perspective within the monastic discipline, and then there is also a certain types of literature which deals with the Buddhist path to enlightenment, where again certain sort of discriminatory attitudes are reflected. For example, the lifetime, the single lifetime within which the individual will become fully enlightened is said to be necessarily a male form. Partly because it is implied. The implication seems to be that in the male form there is less obstacles.
Obstacle means that
The external sort of less external obstacles.
Then the Tantrayana, there are four different level of Tantrayanas. Then the highest Tantrayana, which is usually called Mahamudra Yoga Tantrayana. Now they are very clear. Thoma Wang Shivakarine, Shapat Shama, so Samat Samatol Thomas Munisha. Tamjusun Kudulich, Pumilia, and Yamishana, Nivashia, Shuji, the Nete. Any time of those signs in Pumi, then the Sanya Sheshe, but they are self.
However, the highest standpoint of Buddhism, which is considered to be the Tantric Vajrayana standpoint, within that system, right from the beginning, which is the stage when you take full initiation, empowerment, even from that stage, and also when you observe the commitments and pledges and so on, and until the final realization of your full spiritual potential, there is all throughout the whole course of your path, there is total equality between men and women, and that represents the ultimate standpoint of Buddhism. So what we could say is that if you examine carefully what exactly is the position of Buddhism on the question of women, is that because we do see certain sort of discriminatory tendencies in some of the forms of Buddhist practices, there seems to be a very conscious, explicit attention paid to the position and role of women within the spiritual path, so much so that there are very specific practices in the Tantric Buddhism where more special attention has to be paid towards women, giving respect to them and being always mindful of according them the due respect. And so from a sort of a wider perspective, one could say that the position of men and women in Buddhism is really fundamentally equal.
One thing I would like to mention, you referred to the role of media. There are from time to time, when I had opportunity to meeting with the press of the great group of the press, a few occasions I mentioned I believe because of human nature, when some negative things, a negative event happen, such as killing or some negative things, then because basic human nature is the opposite nature, so these give human mind some surprise, shock. So it becomes news. The other thing is the positive, you see, human activities about the kindness, the helping or serving. These positive things in deep our mind take for granted. So you see, not become not news. So the newspaper or media usually, you see, they give the news. It's a big headline. so eventually, you see, in people's mind, you see, I mean, the newspaper or media, you see, provide our human mind, so there are many negative things, negative events. Eventually, see, people somehow brainwashed, affected in their mind. Then you see, believe human nature is negative. Human nature is hopeless. So that you see lead depression. I think that's some I think very important matter. So the newspaper or media, I think, better to present equal, balanced. So there are a lot of negative things there, and also I think the human positive role also limitless. So in order to keep our determination, our hope, I think the presentation of other side also I think equally important. That I would like to make. Thank you.
At this juncture, I would like to exercise the chair's prerogative by interjecting a very short comment of my own. And I think it's fair to say that the idea of equality, rooted in the Enlightenment and through the democratization process now universally accepted, is a new phenomenon in human history. Many great traditions, to be sure, provide resources for human flourishing for both men and women, but for various reasons, social, political, economic reasons, in the pre-modern period, invariably in the West, in the East, in historical religions, and in primary traditions, women were discriminated against, marginalized, and often their voices silenced. If we look at great spiritual traditions as streams that continue to flow when they're confronted with the challenges of the imperatives of modernity, so to speak, they will have to adjust, they will have to transform, they will have to change. I think one great contribution of His Holiness is his openness and willingness to transform Buddhism as he sees fit in encountering with not only other major religious traditions, but also with modernity. And I'm sure this is the case with Islam and the case with Hawaiian spirituality and other traditions as well. We do have a question for His Holiness concerning the United States. I combine two questions. One, the United States is perhaps one of the most violent societies in the industrialized world. And I would like to interject, according to a recent survey, out of 100,000, per 100,000 in Japan on a yearly basis, maybe 2.5 murders attributed to gunshot wounds. In the United States, the figure is very high, such as 575.2 per 100,000. So we are in a very violent society. Now, what message do you give to the so-called, quote, failures of our competitive Western society, let's say American society, the homeless, the unemployed, the depressed, the drug addicts? After all, their needs are so physical and fundamental to survival, and there seems to be so little relevance to many of them of spirituality. The need for survival and the need for material goods in this sense, or some economic, social, political changes, seem somehow to relegate spiritual matters to the background. What is your advice to the situation at hand?
That's very difficult. Of course, I am a Buddhist monk or Buddhist practitioner. So I think, because of that, I always look, and then the Buddhists, I think the way of practice is the training of mind. So some people described Buddhism is as the science of mind. So as my daily practice, the training or the transformation about the mental states. So therefore, for such a person, they look various different problem. I always see a clear connection with mental state. So generally, I believe in a society where a little bit, I think, the negligence about the internal spiritual development, then naturally, these the unhappy situation, occur. Then perhaps America, in a way, is a multi-culture nation. Of course, there are positive aspect. Then I think negative aspect, perhaps, America. Now here means the new immigration. They come from different countries. So settle in a vast land. They are in a way very young nation. And the generation goes, you alienated, right? Alienated from your ancestors, a long cultural heritage. And expecting some new way of life, new culture. But that also, very difficult. Within, 200-300 is difficult. So therefore, that also maybe is one factor. And in the meantime, a lot of facility and a lot of freedom. And then meantime, too much, I think, very strong competitions. So these, perhaps, I think, again, I must say, it's my knowledge, about this nation, of course, very limited. So, I think, fortunately, look, America, different places, just a few days. So consume all these positive things. not go as well, not go to that. Thank you, Luada. To do those things. Somebody long check. Can you even allow them what you go?
Fortunately, most of my trips are rather short, so I tend to sort of move from one place to another place and enjoy the more positive aspects of the society, and do not have the time to really get deep into the more sort of negative or negative, the bad sides.
So anyway, my knowledge is very limited, so it's difficult to say, it's difficult to make suggestion. But overall, I do feel that kind of feeling. So all these Western nation, or the nation where the external material development highly advanced. Now in these area, naturally, I think the material development through science and technology, you can enjoy it, you can consume the result immediately. On the other hand, it's a spiritual field. It is still, compare external matter, then internal spiritual matter is still more, mysterious. So you see, the people immediately is more attraction towards the external thing. So go that way, eventually neglect about internal health, internal well-being. So So that's, I think one important factor. This I believe.
This is quite sensitive, but I'll raise the question anyway. I've heard that you describe, this is to His Holiness, I've heard that you describe homosexuality as a kind of, quote, sexual misconduct. Could you clarify your statement and how much you reconcile your statement, if that's true, with the Buddhist philosophy of love, compassion,